We are delighted to have the opportunity this afternoon for a conversation on a topic of real political and economic and social relevance to the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela. It's a topic that has been on many people's minds for some time, given the importance of the country, given the concern of the direction that it may be headed, and given the pending Summit of the Americas, in which Venezuela has come back to the fore as a potential topic of real conversation and dialogue. So we have the opportunity today to talk to and speak with three genuine experts on Venezuela who are well-known, highly regarded, and all three friends of the Council of the Americas, and we're just delighted to have them with us in one panel. All of you know who have been following Venezuela that the last 2 years in that country's history have been particularly trying, particularly difficult. The drop in energy prices globally has clearly impacted Venezuela and the government and economy and people of that country. We read about shortages, we read about inflation, we read about deteriorating infrastructure, and yet the president continues forward in the context of the Bolivarian revolution that was initiated by his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, and is somebody who has fundamentally remade Venezuela. Just recently, for those of you who follow the IMF and projections, that particular institution has predicted that 2015 will bring a fall in Venezuela's GDP of 7%. That's on top of a fall in 4% from last year. So year on year, this is becoming quite a concerning economic scenario. So with that in mind, and given the political issues in Caracas, and as I mentioned, the pending Summit of the Americas just 2 weeks from now, or not even 2 weeks from now, next week in Panama City, our three experts today have the opportunity to help us to peer into the future just a little bit, to understand what's happening on the ground in Venezuela, to put some projections and ideas forward in terms of what we may be anticipating and expecting, and to give us a sense from their perspective, from the political and economic and energy perspectives, on where Venezuela may be headed. And we recognize that not one of us has a crystal ball, and not one of us can actually predict the future. So this is an idea to try to get some scenarios out there and to try to discuss probabilities in terms of what could be happening. Our first speaker, our first panelist, is the last U.S. ambassador in Caracas, Ambassador Patrick Duddy. I served with Patrick for many years in the U.S. State Department. He is now at Duke University, where he heads the Latin America program there and has several joint appointments. He is, as I mentioned, the last U.S. ambassador who departed in 2010. Prior to his assignment there, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere. And as all of you know, he also occupied a number of other positions as a real, not just an official, but a thought leader in the context of the U.S. government's Latin America policies, not just with Venezuela, but toward the region broadly. So, Ambassador, great to have you back at this table. We very much appreciate that. The second panelist will be Alejandro Grisanti, who, as all of you know, is the Managing Director and Head of Latin America Research at Barclays Capital. Barclays just came out with their own projections in terms of inflation and some economic indicators for Venezuela, which were hair-raising. So we want to hear a little bit about that as well. Prior to joining Barclays, Mr. Grisanti founded and directed his own consultancy firm, Ecoanalítica, and was also the chief economist at Banco de Venezuela. So his background is deep, and he brings a very firm understanding of economics in Venezuela to the table. Our third speaker is Francisco Monaldi, who is currently at Harvard University as a visiting professor of energy policy at the Kennedy School, and he is also a senior research fellow of the Environment and Natural Resources Program. Dr. Monaldi is a leading scholar on the politics and economics of the oil industry and oil wealth management in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, as well as developing countries more broadly, and he's consulted, as you would anticipate, for a number of leading institutions, including the World Bank and the IMF. So as I say, we have just a stellar panel this afternoon. We've asked each of them to make some opening comments to frame the conversation from their perspective. Then we'll have a bit of a conversation, and in the time remaining, ask each of you to participate to the extent that you would like to with your comments and questions and ideas.
I thought this morning I would begin just by casting, putting a few things out there, looking backward as well as forward, if you will, as a kind of warm-up for our other two panelists, whom I'm also very interested and anxious to hear. First, as Eric suggests, things over the last 2 years, by any objective measure, have gotten worse in Venezuela. Right? First, Nicolas Maduro was, and this is a part of what makes things worse, Nicolas Maduro was elected with under 2% of the vote in a disputed election, following which there were over apparently 3,000 complaints of irregularities, virtually none of which were exhaustively explored. Right? This is important because it suggests the degree to which Maduro, as Chavez's successor, was forced to embark on this new administration with a much smaller political base. And it's important to recognize, too, that he campaigned as someone who would carry on Hugo Chávez's legacy as faithfully as humanly possible. If the pollsters are to be believed, he began the campaign following Chávez's death with about 15 percentage points of an advantage, which is to say that over the course of the 6-week campaign, he essentially lost a percentage to 2 percentage points of that advantage every single week. Right? In other words, the longer he was at it, the worse it got. Right? Now, a problem. Obviously, a leader with a sense of his own fragility vis-a-vis his base and the electorate at large. Economically, what's happened? Essentially, the economy has already crashed. Right? We have heard a lot of speculation about how bad it might be at some point in the future, but if you follow the media, and the media has been largely cowed, except for a couple of independent newspapers. If you follow the media pretty much anywhere in Venezuela, you will see that week to week, it is the narrative is inflation, scarcity, crime. Right? Inflation was 68 point something or other % last year, and I'm sure our colleagues will have more information on that, but the current speculation is that it will hit 100% this year. Scarcity of many basic goods, part of the canasta básica, was so severe, and it has been so severe for so long, that at one point the central bank was publishing a regular sort of index of scarcity. Apparently, when things passed 30% of the canasta básica, the solution was to suspend publication of the index. Right? Crime remains at extraordinarily high levels. By most independent standards, Venezuela is the second most violent country in the world among countries not at war. But Caracas is probably the most violent capital city in the world, with a homicide rate that is truly terrifying. Now, oil. Oil generates approximately 96% of all of the country's export earnings. And the country depends on those export earnings for at least 50% of the national budget, probably now much more than that. Obviously, oil has dropped by more than 50%. Not surprisingly, these numbers have precipitated an immense drop in President Maduro's popularity and the popularity of the government. This is confirmed in virtually every survey. The most recent numbers I've heard, seen in some cases, I actually have one of the recent surveys with me, place his support anywhere from 22 to 25, 26%. This is a very, very, very dramatic drop when you remember that it was only in 2006 that President Hugo Chavez himself had well over 60%. And even in 2012, an clearly weakened president had a very, very substantial victory over his principal opposition, Enrique Capriles. So that the president began his administration in a much weaker position than his predecessor, and virtually all of the indicators on which he would base any sort of optimistic projections into the future have deteriorated. We have seen signs of division within the ranks. The Marea Socialista, which is a constituent, which is an element, a supporting element to the government's party, has periodically begun to express deep reservations about the government's economic program. Obviously, the former Minister of Planning was pushed out and was later quoted in the media, in the Venezuelan media, as saying, we've become economically the laughingstock of the region. The demonstrations last year, I think, cost the Venezuelan government an enormous amount of its remaining credibility. There were nearly 4 dozen people killed, hundreds injured, thousands arrested, detained at least briefly, and released. People like Leopoldo Lopez remain in jail. Now, what do I see in this scenario that should particularly concern us? It's the erosion of the, in particular, of the Chavista base. I think the latitude for a change in direction, the avenues open to Nicolas Maduro are closing, right? Are closing if they haven't already closed. What the numbers tell us, 22, 24, 25%, is that possibly for the first time since President Chavez survived the crisis that led to the recall referendum, the Chavista base is eroding. The Chavista base is eroding. Going forward, what I fear most is not that there will be some sort of apocalyptic clash between the opposition and the government, but rather that the government itself will begin to come apart at the seams, and that the heretofore relatively calm lower economic strata will lose patience with the government. This is particularly dangerous, I think, in the Venezuelan context, because we have seen in the past what happens when there is a widespread sense of disillusionment and frustration with the government, and that's the Caracazo of 1989. So I think that there's real danger of things getting profoundly worse. I'm not at all certain what it will look like or how long it will last. The country has been deteriorating for a long time. When I was there as ambassador, I remember going around looking for milk or looking for flour or cooking oil with my wife, particularly one year as she was trying to make Christmas cookies and couldn't find the basic ingredients. Things are a lot worse now. how long will the Venezuelan public put up with this? I think that's an open question, and I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, and you've really put some interesting ideas on the table and frankly given us a lot to chew on. Ambassador, thank you very much. We're going to move a little bit from the political side more to the economic side. Alejandro, with your comments, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. Thank you for the Consul of America for the invitation. The first thing that I want to say is that the oil, the contraction in the oil price is part of the Venezuelan failure. But we need to go a little bit back in order to see that the real failure is the economic model. I want to say that last year, when oil price the Brent was near $120 per barrel, okay, the Venezuelan basket was something surrounding $100 per barrel. In the first semester, in the first half, that is the official figures that we have, the economy already contracted almost 5%, 4.9, and the inflation reached 4.58, almost 60%. So when they have plenty of dollars, when the government of Maduro have a lot of money, a lot of resources, okay, that in order to try to solve the needs of the Venezuelan people, of the needs of the Venezuelan population, we have this very dramatic framework, okay, on the economic front. We are of the opinion, and that's the reason that we are very pessimistic, is that of course the decline in oil prices will be like an accelerator of the crisis, will be something that will increase the speed of the vicious cycle, okay, that Venezuela is right now. And the thing that we are looking as of today is an economy that is basically on free fall and that will easily reach hyperinflation, okay, during this year. As you know, there are no official figures yet for the first quarter of the year, neither on inflation, of course, nor on the GDP. But something that for me is very clear is that this economy, okay, is collapsing more fastly than many people were believing from before. The answer of the government to this failure economic and the answer of the model of the government to the decline in oil prices was a very strong adjustment. A very strong adjustment that do not address any of the distortion that Venezuela has, and this is something that I want to mention. The first adjustment that they have, or that they have done, okay, this year is a very strong cut to the flows of dollars to the private sector. Okay, the numbers that we have access, okay, that are non-official ones, I need to say, is that the flows of dollars, okay, to the private sector went from $180 million in 2012 to $135 million in 2013 to $90 million in 2014, and in the first 3 months of the year, these flows of dollars, of currency, hard currency to the private sector reached $40 million. So we are talking that the first answer of the government was to reduce, okay, the flows of dollars to the private sector from $90 million to $40 million. Again, these are non-official figures, but one of the things that we did in Barclays is to ask the 6 principal banks and have an average of the contraction in the flows of dollars, in the flows of approval dollars to the private sector, and the number in the last year was very similar. That was around 55% contraction, okay, in the flows of dollars to the private sector. What will happen in this case? For me, it's very clear that the private sector that is still operating there, okay, will not have the prime material that they need to import in order to produce, in order to try to reduce the contraction, in order to try to increase the supply of goods, okay, that the Venezuelans need to buy. This is the first reaction that we see on the government. The second reaction that we see on the government was the new SIMADI rate, the new SIMADI exchange rate system, where the government officialized a very weak exchange rate of 194 bolivars per dollar as of Sunday. The SIMADI is the worst of all worlds, okay? And I need to say it because it is important to say that first, that the answer of the government was a nominal appreciation of the exchange rate. Back in December, the flows of dollar that was bigger to the private sector, they sold 75% at the rate of 6 and 12, and 25% at the level of 50 bolivars per dollar that was the SICAD 2 rate. Right now, and according to the central bank, and this is our official figure, the government is selling 99% at 6.3 and 12, and just 1% at the SIMADI rate at 193. And the weighted average of the exchange rate that the government is using to sell dollars goes from 15% in December, 15 bolivars per dollar in December to 10 bolivars per dollar in the first 3 months of the year. So we have an economic shock, we have a decline in oil prices, and the answer of the government was basically to reduce, to appreciate in nominal terms, in the middle of a very high inflation, in nominal terms to appreciate the exchange rate. And this is the worst for all worlds also, because you are putting there an official exchange rate that every day is validated by the central bank, that the private sector will need to use to make the accounting of their costs, and that will be transferred in prices. I mean, they will use this new SIMADI rate. Most of the headquarters of the multinational here in the US or all around the world will ask their companies in Venezuela to adjust their balance to the new SIMADI rate, causing, of course, a lot of losses, okay, and also an important increases on prices. By the other hand, if you have a weaker exchange rate for a government that used to manage all the dollars that the economy produces, okay, they are not taking any advantage of the devaluation or the official, or to put this new exchange rate official. I mean, they are not selling dollars at this weaker exchange rate, and we are not improving the fiscal account. So for this reason, we are of the opinion, for the nominal appreciation of the exchange rate, that at the end the government is not receiving enough bolivars to make the spending that they are doing. And we are of the opinion, we didn't see the figures yet because it was not released by the central bank, that all the monetization that they start to do it in 2012 will increase a lot in 2015, and of course these more bolivars, more coins and more bolivars on the street will also put a lot of pressure on prices. We are of the opinion again that the inflation could reach near 200% this year, double almost what Ambassador Duddy say, and we are expecting a contraction until now of 7%, but could be even bigger. The other point, and for me is a signal that this distortion could last for longer, is the answer of the government. They start the SIMADI rate at 170. They realized that the demand was higher of the supply, of course, because the government was not selling dollars, okay? But the answer of the government instead, or the authorities, instead to try to increase the supply at the SIMADI rate in order to look that the SIMADI rate will converge, okay, a little bit to the CENCOEX and SICAD 1 rate, they didn't do that. They are not increasing the supply, and they are allowing the currency to depreciate even more. To have an idea, and we used to build a model of an equilibrium exchange rate and see the distortion, the equilibrium exchange rate in Venezuela could be something near 35 bolivars per dollar. With all the political noise, with Maduro there, maybe it will be higher, maybe 45, 50. But the thing that I want to put it on the table is that 6.3 and 12 are something that do not have any economic fundamental to try to sell dollars at that price, do not reflect really the fundamentals of the Venezuelan economy at that price. But it's also true that to try to sell dollars at 200 do not also reflect any fundamentals on the exchange rate system. We call this an FX craziness, and until now, the first reaction of the government was not to increase the supply of dollars to this a new exchange rate system, was basically to allow the currency to depreciate a little bit more. And I want to have another topic to talk in my 5 minutes that I already passed. That is, who is in command of economic policy? I mean, what is the rationality behind, okay, the economic policy that they are doing? That at the end, and I will need to say the answer, my answer will be I don't know. It was a very important book that was published last week by Minister Giordani. Minister Giordani used to be the head, okay, the oracle of Chavez and the Chavismo, where he basically said that he back in 2013 he recommend, and he published in this book the memo that he wrote to President Maduro, where he basically recommend to President Maduro that he need to cut spending, that he need to increase the domestic price of the gasoline, that he need to increase the tariff, that he need to look for some convergence on the exchange rate, that he need to devalue the exchange rate. This was the recommendation of Jordani at that moment. And something that happened that everybody knows is that Jordani is not in the government anymore. He was replaced by Merentes. And Merentes also made exactly the same recommendations, and he was replaced by Ramirez. And Ramirez was doing exactly the same recommendation, and he was replaced by Marcos Torres. And at the end, the only one who is not recommending anything is the one who is in charge of the economic policy in Venezuela, and who is the one who is depreciating the currency in a way that will produce higher inflation, that will produce higher imbalance on the fiscal account, and at the end, with this disruption, okay, in the system of relative prices, unfortunately, I am on the position in Barclays, we are very negative with the implosion that we are looking and that we will see on the Venezuelan economy if they do not change the trend that they are working right now.
Alejandro, let me just very briefly, because I know we do need to get to Francisco for his comments as well, but do you see a crash here, or do you see kind of a continued slow glide downward that gets to some point in the future, we don't know where, but or do you see this big kind of explosion?
Yeah, I believe that we are actually in levels, I mean, informal sources that we could have from the central bank are pointing that we are running at double-digit inflation figures in January and February. Of course, March, maybe in 15 days we could have the March figures. And you are starting to see a very strong disruption in the case of the economy. But I believe that this could, I mean, at the end, usually you in economy do not have an implosion, that everything disappear. The Venezuelan economy will continue there, the Venezuelans will continue there, and we think more dramatic, but in a very fast trend, a deterioration on the economy.
Thank you. Well, we've had two very optimistic presentations so far. Francisco, what can you do to lighten our mood here about energy in the Venezuelan context?
You need to start saying that Venezuela has 300 billion barrels on the Ramon reserve.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's not, I mean, the official number is probably not true, but you are right that we have a lot of geological potential and big reserve. So, I mean, as you heard before, the Venezuelan economy is totally dependent on oil, and so that's why it's so relevant to discuss about the prospects of the oil industry. First, I have to remind you that this is a country that received the largest windfall in its history in the 10 years before 2014. I mean, it's more than 300% of GDP in additional revenues. That was more than almost 3 times what the average country in the region received during the commodities boom. So it is, and by the way, in terms of GDP, it was similar to sort of Middle Eastern levels of the size of the windfall. So very significant windfall, and that partly has to do, of course, with the increase in the price of oil, but also President Chavez was lucky that before coming into power, there was an oil opening that basically added about 1 million barrels of private, of joint ventures or projects that were developed with private investors. And even though the production of the national company PDVSA has been very significantly declining, these other projects sort of allow him to sustain a combination of very high prices with a relatively high level of production, although declining. So what are the sort of the bad news that we had even before the collapse of the price of oil? A variety of bad trends. First, production was, as you know, declining about 700,000 barrels since 2007. Last year, about 100,000 barrels. This year, I think there will be a slight decline, maybe between 0 and 50,000 barrels. Net exports have fallen even faster because the domestic market has grown to close to 800,000 barrels. and Venezuela is importing between 100 and 150,000 barrels between products for the domestic market and oil and products to blend with the extra heavy to re-export. So that means that the net exports of Venezuela, which are the relevant figure, have declined even more than production, at least 850,000 barrels since 2007. Already mentioned that the domestic market is, as you know, a tremendous drain. Venezuela sells, I'm not talking about a gallon of oil, but a barrel of oil, for cents on the dollar. And the next country that sells the cheapest domestic gasoline in the world is Saudi Arabia, that sells it at $21, and Venezuela sells it for cents. So it's really a crazy situation. Smuggling can be as high as 100,000 barrels, and people make more than 600.
Is that
times.
a day?
Yes, 600.
100,000 barrels smuggled a day?
Yes. And about so that's a good business, as you can imagine. and on the other side, on the Colombian side, you have more than 600 times. You can get more than 600 times at the black market rate for your gasoline. So it's a crazy situation. Of course, you have also the fact that the cash flow of PDVSA is restricted by the fact that you have to repay the China loans that that PDVSA pays what the government got. We have the subsidized programs to our Venezuela's neighbors that Alejandro recently published a report showing that it has declined significantly, and so there is a discussion of how much it has declined, if it's to 50% of what it has, or about 20%. But there is no doubt that they are trying to reduce the oil that they sell to subsidize markets. The other big bad news is that the mix. If you look at the production of Venezuela, it's declining, but there is something worse happening, which is that the mix of the oil production is getting much heavier. Getting into extra heavy oil and heavy oil. To give you an idea, I mean, the western area of Venezuela, the Lake of Maracaibo Basin, has been declining for more than a decade, and more than 1 million barrels. So in since 2007, it declined from about 1.1 million barrels to 740,000. But the eastern area of Venezuela, particularly in the northern Monagas areas, had some of the most productive fields in the country that are not as old as the ones in the Maracaibo Basin. And production there was relatively stable. I mean, there was a discussion, but the official figures showed that it was going up. And now, in the last 4 years, it has declined about 300,000 barrels. And that's the area where that was the cash cow of PDVSA. El Furrial, it's the field with the largest production in the country. Was a field that you produced for less than $7 per barrel, and you sold it at the price that the market had. So it was a very profitable area. And now that is going down, and that's a double bad news, because on top of you losing your cash cow, that oil was the one you were using to blend with the extra heavy. So that's the reason why Venezuela is importing products, and now also lighter oil from Africa, and they are trying to figure out a way into expanding the blending, because the only thing that is going up is the Orinoco Belt, and that's the area where production is actually going up in the Orinoco Belt. It's not compensating, as I said, the total production, but it's to some extent, compensating a little bit by increasing about 200,000 barrels since 2010 in that area. The other thing is that the production that is actually, the share of the JVs, of the joint ventures, is increasing in Venezuela's total production. And as you know, in those projects, the foreign partners have between 30 and 40% of the equity. So that means that that you're losing market share of the area that is 100% owned by PDVSA, and you're getting more production in the one that it's that you have to share your profits with others. Investment in exploration and production has not increased significantly. If you see the number of oil rigs in operation, they are pretty stable at around 70 and much lower than they need to be to increase production. Whereas, so investment relatively flat in what is relevant in real terms. But on the other hand, the debt going up dramatically from $3 billion in 2006 to $46 billion today. Still, you know, PDVSA is less leveraged than sorry, my time is gone according to my it's less leveraged than Petrobras and Pemex, but it's you know, the trend is really bad. Then the barrels the number of barrels produced per employee has declined to a third of what it was, because, you know, the number of employees has skyrocketed, and so a lot of bad trends. But what it's sort of if you want to call it sort of the silver lining, it's you could call it either pragmatism or desperation. But what the government has been doing in the last 2 years is a very significant shift in sort of the at least the tone of the way they are dealing with foreign partners. And so they have done, they basically are asking the foreign companies, what can we do to get you to invest in Venezuela? That's basically it. And so they have a checklist of things, and they have gone through the checklist, and some of these things have happened. For example, a reduction of the windfall tax, exemption of the windfall tax for new projects, more operational control in some of the projects for the partners. These loans to the JVs from the foreign partners, that the first one being one with Chevron that was negotiated in 2012 but signed last year, and basically it has you know, allowed the Petroboscan to be financed by Chevron. Partly is, you know, recognition of the existing debt, but it's also some fresh money coming in, and it has allowed some of these increase that I mentioned in the JV's investment. Other companies have followed the Chevron trend and have signed deals like that, and so that's that they recently announced that they will use the more depreciated exchange rate for some of the for bringing some of the money in. And the other thing is that the government clearly has moved away from the idea that they will force these companies to make big investment in upgraders, in refineries inside Venezuela, and are, you know, giving them sort of free range to move into a blending strategy, which is the only thing that they can get at this point in terms of investment. So, so there is clearly a dramatic change in that sense, and as just recently Reuters and New York Times have reported other sort of symbolic things that, you know, people are not dressing in red in meetings with the partners, and you know, are using ties, which is not common in PDVSA anymore, and that kind of thing that of course is more you know, symbolic than anything else, but it shows that the situation is changing. However, you know, considering the collapse in the price of oil, considering the cash flow problems that PDVSA has now, that it has to finance at least more than $10 billion in cash flow shortages in terms of if they want sustained investment. Of course, the issues related to the lack of human capital in PDVSA, the operational problems that the company has, the macro instability that the country is facing, the issues related to, you know, the difficulties getting anything done in the country, the crime issue, the insecurity, all these things combined with the fact that the price of oil, you know, is much lower, and that you have other competitors like Mexico, you know, opening with a much better institutional environment, I think make it really hard for them to get significant additional investment. However, having said that, I do think that there will be some increase in production in the Orinoco Belt. I don't know if it will be sufficient to offset the decline in the conventional areas of Venezuela, but certainly movement in the country than there was a couple of years ago.
And play that out for us just a little bit. I mean, oil prices have gone down recently, but oil prices can also go back up. So to the
Sure.
extent that in the medium term you might see a return, probably not to $120 a barrel anytime soon, but maybe to something higher than it is now. How does that affect your analysis one way or the other going forward?
Yeah, I mean certainly an increase in the price of oil will give them a little bit of room to do the necessary investments and to avoid the continuation of the decline, and will give them some breathing room, both I mean from the perspective of PDVSA, but also of course of the country. At the current levels, things are very tough. By the way, some of the international media have sort of pointed figures of break-evens of Venezuela that are very high, that I think are not accurate in the sense that they are taking into account a very appreciated exchange rate, basically all these projects that had to be done with refineries inside the country, with upgraders and all that. I mean, the Venezuela can produce oil for a much lower cost than, I mean, even with the current price. However, having said that, you are competing with other countries, and the margins are certainly much smaller. So it's tough, and marketing extra heavy oil is not an easy thing. The blended oil that they have been producing has been heavily discounted.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, you had a comment on it.
It is that all of this may take place. I mean, they may increase in production, particularly in the Orinoco. There may be somewhat more investment in the sector, but it is going to be in the context of a larger economy that is dysfunctional. Virtually none of the other non-petroleum industries is working at anything like a sustainable level, and most of the heavy industry, industrial activity over in what's known as the Guayana has come to a halt. One of the things that I would add in this context is that the country was experiencing substantial inflation and dramatic shortages when oil was at $100 a barrel.
Exactly.
And so things will not all necessarily get better just because oil goes up, right? And in the meantime, and this is a real danger, in the next however many months, we're looking at legislative elections, and we know that the government has historically invested heavily in these elections, and that has involved diverting monies that might otherwise be invested in infrastructure into the electoral context. With the president limping along at about 25%, the government knows there's a real danger that they will lose the control of the legislature unless they campaign effectively. And so this is an issue.
So let me play that out a little bit, because it's probably the pregnant issue in terms of everybody's thinking now. We've set the table with three very sophisticated presentations from similar but different perspectives. But looking forward, I mean, we've just painted a scenario, or a scenario has just been painted for us that's pretty desperate. And in any democratic society, you would predict that the next election would be a significant change, or at least some sort of new path or direction or whatever. So Patrick, let's start with you. And from your sense as both as an ambassador, but also subsequent to that in your very close observation of the country, how long, and nobody's predicting a government's going to fall or any invasion or any of that craziness, but how long does the government keep going? I mean, I could even say, how long does the government hold on?
Well, I think actually the government can probably hold on for a while.
Okay.
But I think that what we will see is that the space for sort of a legitimate challenge to the government by the opposition will continue to shrink. The question, and we alluded to this actually before we began, is what happens when the place touches bottom? Does it essentially simply continue to stumble along? To some degree, this this invites us to consider the nature of the opposition and whether there is a viable alternative project to the government out there. And the opposition still looks, while it looks, more substantial than it did 5 or 6 years ago, there are still pretty significant fissures within the opposition.
Francisco, how about your comments on the same question?
Yeah, well, as you pointed out, in any normal country, you see the polls today. The opposition could win by a landslide, right? The elections, there is a 30-point spread between the government and the popularity of Maduro, as Patrick mentioned, is about 25%. It has, it has increased slightly. So it recently, at least it didn't continue to decline, even though, for example, the percentage of people who think the country is going in a good direction continues going down to about 10%. So you would have expected Maduro to go down in the last 4 months, and he hasn't. We can discuss if it's because of the...
Yeah, I would just interrupt by saying, including in one of the newest polls that I have with me today, one of the curious things about this, with which I agree, is that Maduro appears to have more or less plateaued, but it is very clear from polling that the bulk of the public blames the government for the current circumstances.
Sure.
Right? So there's a certain amount of tension right there. And clearly the numbers would suggest that this unhappiness with the government has significantly eroded the base of support that Chavismo has been able to depend on for the last decade or so.
And I think, we cannot expect that the opposition will win by the margins that you would anywhere else predict, for a variety of reasons. First of all, electoral system. You have a system that has a lot of malapportionment, and the Chavismo is very powerful in the rural areas of the country. So that means that if the opposition gets, in order to get 50% of the seats, it probably has to get about 54% of the vote. So that's one thing. Then gerrymandering. They have done gerrymandering in the past. We don't know how much additional they could do. I am expecting that if they do anything, they will do a sort of defensive gerrymandering, meaning that they will try to guarantee that the opposition doesn't get more than 60% of the seats, rather than trying to, because they know that they are in a situation of declining voting shares. They might do other things in that direction. Of course, the control of the media, all these other factors, and the fact that the government plays this thing at the external enemy, and this variety of strategies. We can expect some of these strategies, like the Dacaso that we had before, when they basically forced the electrical appliance stores to sell at sort of half the prices, and they got a bump of 10%. Having said all that, I think it's if the votes are counted, I think the opposition will win the majority of the seats in the National Assembly. I don't know how much that will, change the situation in the country, but clearly will mark a big departure from the last 16 years in which they have had, control of every single institution.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, let me add
Please,
something.
Alejandro.
Yeah, I believe that in order to answer this question that was similar of what Francisco and Duddy say, is we need to see the result of the National Assembly. And there are two results that we need to focus. The first one is the difference in vote, that the opposition could gain against the government. For example, if we solve this economic situation, if the opposition win 55-45, for me, my personal opinion will be a very negative result for the opposition, because he cannot trigger some of the constitutional tools that the opposition has, for example, the recall referendum the following year. So we need to first, and I will get back to this, we need to first focus on the difference on votes that each party will have. And the second very important thing is how many deputies the opposition have. If it's just a simple majority, if it's a super majority of 60%, or if the opposition obtain the 2/3, in which we will have a higher political confrontation on the National Assembly for a possible change. And I believe also that the share of vote is important, because for the recall referendum, that is one of the things that is more in fashion in the market, in the political thing that the people are thinking in 2016, I want to say something. In order to win the recall referendum, the opposition need to obtain more votes of what Maduro have in 2013. And usually, with a presidential election, okay, the level of abstention is reduced drastically. In the case of the last presidential election, the level of abstention was just 18%. For a recall referendum back in 2004 with Chavez, the level of abstention was 32%. So the exercise that we did in order to have an idea is the opposition need 8 million votes in order to have a caution to win really against Maduro. Maduro obtained in the last election 7.6 million votes. I think with 8 million votes will be enough in order to win the recall referendum. If we calculate with the registro electoral permanente, okay, if we calculate, okay, how much need to be the difference between the opposition and the government using the same level of abstention that we have in 2004 with the recall referendum of President Chavez, the opposition need to win 64-36. I mean, the opposition almost need to double in the recall referendum the vote of the Chavismo or the Madurismo in order to win that recall referendum. And for me, that is very important. And this is why we need to, in my opinion, to really focus on the result of the election. If the result will be, as some of the polls is showing, that maybe the opposition could double the Chavismo in this National Assembly election. And also it's very important to see the level of abstention in order to try to forecast some of the possibilities that the opposition could have in 2016.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Thank you for all three of you for your comments there. And I really wanted to draw this out because there does seem to be an impression among observers that Venezuela's on the skids. How much longer can the government last? And we need to prepare for the next step, the end game, the what comes next. And the reality may be something completely different. I mean, we were talking before the program, Patrick, about Zimbabwe, and President Mugabe's been there for 50 years or whatever it is, and he doesn't have oil. So, the response to that, or the reaction, or the analysis has to take this into account, and I think all three of you have done a fine job of raising those very important issues with us. We have about 30 minutes to invite all of you into the conversation for your comments and questions and ideas. If you could please identify yourself by name and organization that you may be representing today, that would be much appreciated. To the extent that the question is going to a particular panelist, feel free to designate that person as well, and we'll continue the conversation with your questions. There's one in the back, please. We are webcasting this. I don't think we have a circulating microphone, so you're just going to have to speak up loudly so we can all hear you, please.
Hi, my name is Mariana Martin. I'm a Columbia University student at the School of International Public Affairs. And my question is for all of you. The scenario for the second half of this year is kind of complicated, starting because we don't know when the elections are going to be. So I guess my first question is, do you have any idea when the elections are going to be? Second, I imagine the ideal scenario for the government is that if they know they're not going to win, they will ideally prefer not to go to elections. Is there any legal space or any nuance there that will happen, or maybe just delay them indefinitely?
So for those who may not have been able to hear, in TV-landia, the question is about the pending elections, when they will be held, and to the extent that it may be more convenient for the government to postpone them or indefinitely, perhaps, is that a scenario on what might occur there? Let's take a couple additional questions. We'll take a round of three, and then we'll ask all the respondents to respond to those, to the extent there are additional questions. Margaret, please.
Margaret Hayes, currently representing, I guess, Georgetown University. Can you talk a bit more about the opposition and its cohesion, organization? I think, one of the big lessons of being in the opposition was offered by the Chileans and the Concertación. If we're gonna, if we don't hang together, we're all gonna hang separately. And so they hung together. And the Venezuelan opposition doesn't seem to have done that in the past. I mean, and they've made mistakes like deciding they weren't going to vote and so forth. Have they learned these lessons? Is this a good horse to bet on at all?
It's another good question, and we'll go to the very far end, Harold, and we'll come back to you, Pedro. But Harold, you next, please.
Thanks. This question is mostly Francisco, but also Alejandro and Pastor, if you want to jump in. Just your take on oil markets going forward in terms of the scenarios for oil remaining at relatively low prices going forward, and how does that close up the government's fiscal space to maybe engage in one of their typical pre-election consumption binges this year?
Harold's got some forward contracts that he's trying to know how to bet. No, I'm teasing. All right, so we've got the elections, we've got the state of the opposition, and we've got predictions in terms of oil market direction. How about if we start in reverse order? Why don't we go, Francisco, with you to talk about energy first, and then we can address the others.
Okay. Well, talking a little bit about the other questions. I mean, on the issue of, I mean, of course, we don't know that I don't have any inside information about the date of the elections, although most people believe they are going to be towards the end of November. I mean, you know, UNASUR said October at some point, and then they retracted September, and then they retracted. So we don't know. I think they are deciding, but it's likely that it's going to be on the last quarter. And I do think that there is a group in the government that always raises the issue that, you know, revolutions do not get out in elections, and if we are going to lose an election, so they I think are going to debate this once again, and depending on how things are, they might, you know, try to create a situation in which they can postpone the elections. I think there is a group in the government that believes that they can manage, that they will lose the election, but they will not lose the 2/3, and that the opposition is very divided going to the other, and they can manage that, and in fact they can, you know, attribute some of the blame for the economic failures to the opposition in Congress. So there is I think that they have still to figure out what their strategy will be, and of course that will depend also on how bad they are faring before the date of the election. I think, I mean, the reading on the Venezuelan opposition could be either terribly pessimistic or not that pessimistic. I mean, the terribly pessimistic is that, yeah, they are.
But you wouldn't go so far as to be optimistic.
I mean, you could say that they are very much divided. They have a very different idea about how things should develop in terms of strategy and tactics. And they are personally, you know, there's a lot of animosity today. So it's hard. It's a problem. However, if you look at similar regimes in the region, the Venezuelan opposition has been the most successful compared to, you know, the Bolivian, the Argentinian, the Nicaraguan, and the Ecuadorian, in terms of, and you could say, well, that's a low bar, but yeah, but in any case, you know, it's tough to fight this type of hybrid regimes, semi-authoritarian regimes. And the Venezuelan opposition at least got its act together to be united in the previous, for example, legislative elections with just one list and just one candidate per circuit. I think despite some tension today, I think they will do that again. They will be able to do that. And if they remain then united after, you know, that, it's hard to know. It's difficult. And I think the government plays very well the divisions inside the opposition, uses strategically who gets into prison and who doesn't, etc., to create distrust and all these kinds of things. And finally, on the oil scenario, I mean, of course, you know, that's a sort of a long and difficult question. My expectation is that you know, that we'll see for at least a couple of years in a scenario in which it's hard to think that the price will go back to what it was because of, you know, the elasticity of supply of shale, etc. But in terms of the elections, I mean, I think that the government is playing with fire, in the sense that they continue spending money as if, you know, the world didn't change. And they are doing these kinds of things that Alejandro mentioned, not devaluing, etc., because they want to win the election. But I think that they might, you know, get into a situation that at some, I'm not a macroeconomist, but I think, you know, they could get into an uncharted territory in terms of, you know, hyperinflation in the country by doing that. And I don't think it will pay that much as in the past, because, you know, printing monopoly money is not, you know, going to generate increase real wages of Venezuelans, and I'm not sure that they will get that much traction this time. I do think that after the election, they will be in a much bigger mess because they will have been postponing all these. I mean, I have heard from people close to the Chavismo that Maduro was very. I mean, he felt that part of the reason why he only won by whatever you believe that if he won or not, but 2%, less than 2%, that partly had to do with the devaluation that they made a couple of months before. And so he's very much unwilling to do anything serious before the election. On the other hand, you from time to time hear that they will raise the gasoline price soon, so it's hard to.
Well, he himself
Oh,
suggested
he has
that
said many times, yeah.
that was going to come. Let me just note a couple of things. I talked to a variety of folks in Houston, and I certainly haven't concluded anything, nor do I think they have. But what I'm hearing is that they would not be surprised by some sort of correction over the summer, but nothing like $100 a barrel, right? That it may go up, enough to ease Venezuela's difficulties. I don't think so. In answer to the earlier question about the legislative elections, I would note that on the same day, I think on the same day, that UNASUR rejected the recently announced U.S. sanctions, or at least the executive order implementing those sanctions, UNASUR also published a comunicado stressing the importance for Venezuela of Venezuela resolving its internal difficulties democratically and stressing the importance of the legislative elections. I emphasize this because I think it is important to understand that the Venezuelans do not want to become the first country in the region to definitively throw democracy over the side. And I think that there will be considerable pressure on the government to hold the elections, and I am hopeful that there will also be pressure or strong encouragement to the Maduro administration to accept election observers and an observation mission that is robust and capable of really evaluating the quality of the election. I suspect that they will be reluctant because if we go back to 2010, we will remember that they probably lost the popular vote in that election for the legislature, even though the government ended up with the majority of the seats, right? This time around, there is the real possibility that the current president of the legislature will lose his job, and that is Diosdado Cabello, if in fact the opposition is sufficiently united and organized and mounts a good campaign.
Let me add just one point. I fully agree with what Francisco and Duddy said. With regard to the timing of the election, in my personal opinion, will be something near October. Okay, and will be something near October because the government or the authorities will need to have time to see the result of the election in order to react to that result with the current National Assembly. The thing that I will expect, and it's something that we already saw, is that with the executive order of the U.S., Maduro received an enabling law that will function until December. The thing that I am expecting is that the opposition win a majority, a simple majority, is that new enabling law will be given to Maduro since December 2015, maybe until December 2018, that his presidential period finished. This is non-unprecedented. This already happened with President Chavez. I don't know if the President Chavez, the duration was 18 months or 2 years. I will not be impressed.
This is in 2012.
In 2010.
Or in
From
2010.
2010 to for 18 months, very near to 2012.
But there was then another one, I think.
So I will not be impressed that maybe they increase even and make longer, okay, the period of a possible enabling law and give for him for 3 years until the end of the presidential period in Maduro. But in order to do that, in order to prepare this strategy, they need to know their results and need to have some time to work on that. And that's the reason that I do not expect at the real end of the year that when maybe will be something near October.
We shall see. We have time for one more round, I think 15 minutes, and I have 1, 2, and 3. So let's go to the back, please speak up.
Okay. Thank you. Isaac Maya from Free Balance, Design Financial Software Systems for Governments. IDB annual conference was just this weekend. Venezuela did not participate. Summit of the Americas coming up. Cuba-U.S. relationships are improving. Any expectations of democracy, elections, all these comments in this upcoming event in mid-April?
Thank you very much. How does the Venezuela scenario impact the Summit of the Americas, please?
Hi, my name is Marcela Colmenares and I work for the Center for Democracy and Development in the Americas. And my question is quite the opposite of Mariana's question from Columbia University. It's the best case scenario. If the opposition wins a supermajority or 2/3, which seems so difficult, but if it happens, I particularly believe that the opposition is united for elections. The rest, we don't know. What do you think you would advise them as a unit to do first once they have that power in the National Assembly?
Interesting question. Pedro.
Pedro Berlin. I have two questions. One, following a little bit of Margaret, is we talked about the opposition, but I'd love to hear your views of what might be happening within the government, the top senior echelons of the government. Had we had this conference a year ago, we would have said that the three more powerful guys below Maduro and Cilia would be Giordani, Ramirez, and Rodriguez, the Minister of Interior. And the three of them are gone, and they seem to be really gone. I mean, not just displaced, but they seem to be. The other powerful guy in the scene is Diosdado Cabello, who has both an electoral sword hanging over him and a bigger sword in terms of accusations of his extracurricular activities, or maybe his main activities. Can you talk a little bit about how the implosion, how this pressure, because this sanctions, which might generate a whole rash or something, does actually continue to fracture the unity and create more fears within the ruling team, and how does that play out? And the second thing, just a quick question in terms of looking forward towards Venezuela. Both candidates, both in 2012 and 2013, had oil policies that were premised on that rapid expansion of production. In one case, 5 million barrels, which is the government case, and in Capriles' case, to 6 million barrels. In the context of what happened right now, and this is more from Francisco, is it an understanding now that we'd be in really deep trouble, if that is what we're all counting on, that the way to get this country out of problems is with production expansion, because there is really no room for that without actually contributing to a further collapse of prices and the time that it takes. So therefore the solution, whether it's this government getting itself out of trouble or something that happens in a transition government, how do you get out of trouble when oil is so greatly compromised and when there's no market room for the increase that both campaigns have promised?
Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Pedro. Alejandro, why don't we start with you on this round?
Okay, let me start with the question of if the opposition obtain a supermajority. Instead to limit to that case, I will answer depending on the result of the National Assembly. Okay, what happens if the opposition obtains something near 70%? If the opposition obtains something near in the number of votes with very low abstention, if the Venezuelan go to vote, okay, go to the electoral center, and the opposition obtain near 70%, I think that the clear way to try to act is trying to activate the recall referendum. I think that in this environment, the Venezuelans will not have the fear to sign. We will have some support to do that and try to move as fast as possible to call for new presidential election, given again the economic tools, the constitutional tools that is there. If the opposition obtains something more near to the 60%, okay, I think that the thing that maybe they could try to do is to try to move for a constitutional amendment, trying to reduce the presidential period and calling for new election. But in this case will be harder because I will expect a fight between the Supreme Court and the other institutions that are basically controlled by the government and the National Assembly. So we will have this fight, but it looks to me that the opposition will not have the strength to move to the recall referendum, and that maybe this second a path is possible to do. And the third part is the opposition wins for 52-48. They need to wait until 2018. There's no other way. I mean, I am not receiving the signal still that the opposition have the strength to try to activate neither the recall referendum or the constitutional amendment. No? So for me, it's like the very clear way to move.
Let's jump over to Patrick, because this question about the Summit of the Americas is an important one. We've touched on it in the discussions, but let's deal with it directly. And Patrick, you've been directly involved in some of these processes in the past, as have others around the table. But you had the impression from late in December that with a thaw in the U.S.-Cuba scenario, that the summit on April 10 and 11 would be a new day, a fresh start. Use your terminology, but then the announcement of the sanctions against seven individuals have seemingly changed that dynamic. Give us your sense as a former diplomat as to how that's playing out, and frankly, what can be done to manage it in Panama in a week and a half.
Well, I suspect that the department is already attempting to get out ahead of it by emphasizing that the sanctions as announced, based on legislation, are not extraterritorial, that they are focused only on, at this point, 7 individuals, and that the measures contemplated in the executive order and in the legislation on which it is based are entirely internal to the United States. Cancellation of visas, freezing of assets, etc. So I suspect they're already trying to get out ahead of that. I would fully expect that the administration will be given an earful by particularly the South American countries because of the executive order. But I also have a sense that those countries want a successful summit. It was, in fact, largely anticipated that Cuba would be the difficult issue, and obviously that has been finessed. I would say finessed in that it is not entirely resolved because the embargo is in place, but the administration has sent a very important signal to, with respect to that, to the hemisphere that they're working on it. Right? I don't think that the hemisphere wants to slip back into the same mode of thinking vis-a-vis Venezuela. It is a very, very different set of sanctions, dramatically more limited. And it seems to me, too, that at least tacitly, and certainly in private conversations I've had with former colleagues from other countries, people understand that Venezuela is, in fact, in very, very deep trouble, and that the government's response over the last couple of years to these, to the, if you will, unfolding tragedy has been very difficult. It has resonated very badly in the hemisphere's media, and I'm not sure that they want to sink the Summit of the Americas over this, but I think they'll make very clear to us just how unhappy they are. Similarly, I think they're making clear to Venezuela how important it is that they in fact hold the elections and that the elections be creditable. Just a couple of things. I'd like to come back to the notion of what to think of the current moment, and specifically touch on the issue of the demise of the last Minister of the Interior. It's important to remember that he lost his job over a clash with the colectivos, right? As nearly as I could tell, right? Where uniform police ended up in a shootout with some of these informally organized but armed groups that support the government, who apparently very insistently demanded his resignation and got it. I saw as kind of a footnote to that something also interesting. I mean, this means that Maduro removed a senior general from a critically important position. He then, very shortly thereafter, announced a 45% raise in salary to the military, though he announced only 15% for the rest of the country. This, to some degree, suggests to me just what a very delicate balancing act he is having to perform inside the government. And I think it is also useful to remember going forward that to some degree the colectivos arise out of the increasing dependency of classes D and E on the government. We heard from Francisco that the number of employees in government companies like PDVSA has skyrocketed. We talk about that in terms of a particular word, the nomina, right? The number of people who are actually on the rolls. If you add the number of people who are on the rolls to the number of people who are getting various other forms of assistance from the government, the number is very high. And it seems to me, particularly because so many other economic sectors are dysfunctional, that we can, I think, reasonably anticipate that those people are going to feel exceptionally vulnerable and desperate to hold on to whatever pedacito they think they have won through Chavismo over the years. Coming back to the issue of the campaign going forward, I think it's going to be really important for the opposition to begin to argue what they would do. That only criticizing the government does not, in and of itself, offer the voting public, particularly those people who are conflicted, a compelling reason to embrace you. They need a program.
As they say in politics, you cannot beat something with nothing. So good point on that.
Yeah.
Final word.
A couple of comments to some of the questions. On the supermajority, I think it will depend not only on the. I agree with what Alejandro said in terms of the scenarios and the options, and the importance of how big the vote for the opposition is. I think it also it's very important what the economic situation is. I mean, if at some point we get to really serious hyperinflation and the like, I think the government will be in very bad shape. And there are other strategies in addition to what Alejandro mentioned, like trying to change the Supreme Court and the Electoral Council. I see a scenario in which we could have in Venezuela two Supreme Courts. The new assembly electing a bunch of additional members of the court, and the court saying that that's unconstitutional, and the assembly saying we are so there could be some big tensions there. The way the opposition might be willing to use their power or not. In terms of the unity of the Chavismo, I think that there are a few things. One, Maduro has been very effective at controlling the party. It's amazing how basically he ran the internal elections in a way in which he took all the power, and he has been getting rid of a lot of potential adversaries, and so in that way he has more control than one would have expected before. On the other hand, Maduro has numbers of say 25. I think eventually they will get lower. But Chavez and the Chavez brand has still, a 50% sort of support. And you could say, well, it's a dead guy who cares. But I think, there is some space for someone claiming that they are the real, successors to the Chavismo mantle. Remember that Chavez went out of power, died actually.
That would explain it.
Yes, died at the time in which still, there was a consumption boom. So there is, most of the population blames Maduro rather than Chavez for what we are dealing with.
But doesn't that, and I'm sorry to prolong prolong this conversation, but this is a critical point right here, because doesn't that then argue that the most likely scenario is not an electoral change to the opposition,
Yeah.
but a change from within the Chavista movement itself?
So that I think could happen. You know, there could be there could be a group inside the Chavismo that said, let's throw this guy under the bus,
Right.
and we have, you know, we can recover sort of the Chavista
The mantle
support.
of Chav-
Yeah.
exactly.
The question is, what would that look like, right? How would that be achieved,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's hard. And then very briefly on the oil issue. I mean, at this point, I think we are trying to avert decline, right? not even, you know, not even going up. And I do agree that the market it doesn't make it any easy for Venezuela to increase production significantly. As I said, at this point, this is not even what it's at stake. It's actually averting decline. On the other hand, depending on how the market plays and OPEC plays, you know, the Iraqis are going up like crazy. The Iranians are going to go up. So if everybody goes up, you don't have anything else to do but to go up. I mean, Venezuela is not in the easiest of places compared to these other countries, but that's what we will have to do. I totally agree that, you know, the numbers that we are talking about are totally. Not in the ballpark.
No, right. Then they don't get Venezuela out of the deep hole it finds itself in, even if they go up a little bit.
Alejandro, final word.
Yes, let me say something that, I mean, with all the respect that I deserve to this country, but as a Venezuelan, I need to also say that I do not understand very well the American policy with regard to Venezuela. No? I don't know if it's a subject of division inside the Department of State, or it's a subject of division between the National Congress and the Department of State. But the thing that I am showing from a very long time before is that a lot of Venezuela came here, okay, before with some criminal charges. We have the case of Ponte a Ponte, we have the case of a narcotics, a person Maclet, we have the case of Pancho Yaramendi that disappeared $500 million from the PDVSA pension funds, and all these people, okay, was basically going to a trial here, was collaborating with the U.S. government, was basically looking to escape from Venezuela. And something that impressed me, that in any of these cases, we have an information release in this case, who was involved in the case of Pancho Yaramendi, with all the dealing of the PDVSA pension funds. We don't have any information released, for example, with the case of Maclet, that it was supposed that a lot of Venezuelan officials was involved in that case. And something that I believe that could improve, okay, the situation in Venezuela is to release some of this information. I don't know how big is the classification, for how long it will be classified or not. But I think that this is something that could help to the situation there, to improve the situation, and to have more clear cuts of who will be in what side and who is in the other inside the government. And of course, that this will help to improve the situation in Venezuela.
Well, as promised, we've just had a graduate level education in Venezuela and a very sophisticated and impressive conversation from three experts. Clearly, the conversation could be extended, but based on the fact that we are at time, we're going to have to call it to a close. Before we thank our guests for their terrific comments, just a couple quick things. First of all, for those of you who have not yet registered for the Washington Conference on April 2021, please be sure to do so. I think you will find it well worth your time, and we'd love to see you then there in that context. Number one. Number two, there are some materials that have just been published. Actually, Ambassador Duddy just had a piece on Venezuela that came out today, and copies are out front for those who would like to take a copy of that and other materials with you as you go. Everything is free and hopefully well worth your time to read. Point number three, would you please join me in thanking our terrific panel for their outstanding comments.